My guest at this time is Gordon Chang. He's an expert in East Asia policy. He's the author of The Coming Collapse of China, and we've talked to him several times as the unrest builds in Hong Kong as the Chinese crack down on Hong Kong demonstrators. And all, of course, goes back to the extradition debate, and even really before that in Hong Kong, as the Hong Kong residents try to fight for the rights that they were promised for the 50 years after the handover to China from the British. And the Chinese government, of course, is looking to infringe on those freedoms ahead of schedule. But now we're seeing more violent reaction from the Hong Kong police to the protesters. We're also seeing the Chinese forces move in on the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So we want to put this all in perspective. And Gordon, thanks very much for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much, Greg.
We see different bits of news pop up here and there, so it's important to have the big picture, I think. Where do you see things standing right now in terms of greater Chinese aggression, whether it's through the Hong Kong police or through their own efforts, and how the demonstrators are reacting to that?
For the last 5 months, the Hong Kong police have been engaged in especially aggressive tactics. And so, for instance, on Monday of this week, a Hong Kong traffic police officer shot an unarmed protester in the torso in circumstances that did not justify the use of any force, especially deadly force. Hong Kong police on Tuesday actually made a sweep of the Chinese University of Hong Kong campus, and again, it didn't seem that there was a justification to do so. But this case, the protesters put up a pitched fight. And after everything was done, the police withdrew, especially with the intervention of the vice chancellor of the university, who's essentially the president. This is another defeat for the Hong Kong police. What's occurred, though, is because of this excessive force, it's galvanized people in Hong Kong society, not the young protesters clad in black, but the general mass of people. And so, for instance, we have seen now in the central business district, office workers come out, sit in the streets, as well as wear masks in defiance of a ban imposed by the Hong Kong government. So essentially we have resistance across the scope of Hong Kong society.
Wow. So the Chinese efforts to get other parts of Hong Kong society to turn against the protesters actually backfired in a fairly spectacular way.
Yes, and we've seen this dynamic over the last 5 months where, every time you think that there might be some fatigue in society for the protests, Beijing will directly or indirectly do something to enrage society. And that's occurred periodically. And some people are saying that Beijing perhaps is deliberately provoking protesters in order to justify a harsh crackdown. But whether it's obliviousness or maliciousness, Beijing is doing things that are stoking tensions in the territory.
So who has the momentum right now?
Right now, the momentum is with the protesters. As Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, the top political officer, says, the place is on the verge of collapse. Maybe that's a little bit dramatic, but the point is she no longer controls Hong Kong, and neither does China. So it's a standoff, but for the moment, the protesters seem to be winning. That could change in an instant, and we've seen momentum shifts over the last 5 months. But right now, the young kids are winning.
We've talked before about the demands. I think there's 5 primary demands that the protesters have at this point, and it's highly unlikely, obviously, that Beijing is going to give in to those. So how does this ultimately end?
Yeah, this could go on for a very long time, Greg. And the reason is that neither side has the power to compel the other side to do what it wants. But right now, I think the Chinese leaders have to be very worried, because the longer that this drags on, the more chance there is of contagion, of people in the mainland deciding to demonstrate to get what they want. People in the mainland, by and large, don't sympathize with the Hong Kong protesters, but they do have things that they complain about. And the protesters in Hong Kong, if they are seen to be getting away with things, and so far that is the case, then I think that China's got to be very worried that there will be copycat protests over other grievances. Got to remember, this is the time when the Chinese economy is slumping, and you've got all sorts of other problems at the same time. So this is a volatile mix for Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler.
It's fascinating you mentioned that it's actually encouraging potential future protests in mainland China, which doesn't have the freedoms on the books that the folks in Hong Kong have. And it also comes at a time when the social credit system is really ramping up, where the government's essentially watching you all the time. And if you do anything that's considered subversive to Beijing, they can make your life miserable. They can take away your job. They can prevent you from traveling and doing all sorts of things. So the fact that this is actually encouraging folks in mainland China to potentially buck the system there is quite an amazing statement.
Well, it hasn't really happened yet. I mean, since the Hong Kong protests started, there were large-scale protests in Wuhan, which is in the mainland. They lasted a couple days, involved thousands of people, but they were ended. But right now, there's a lot of grievances, and as you point out, the social credit system is not especially popular as it is being implemented, because it is increasingly coercive. Now, people can be coerced, and that's the history of the People's Republic of China. But we also know that there are moments when the Chinese people just lose their fear, or they become desperate, or they just get so angry they do what they want. And that's occurred periodically, and that could very well occur again. Remember, the Hong Kong protesters got what was once their sole demand, which is the permanent withdrawal of the extradition bill by Carrie Lam. Now, of course, they've got other demands, and right now China is not willing to give in to those other demands. But if it doesn't, it's going to have a permanent problem in Hong Kong.
Lastly, Gordon, and we always mention this each time we have this conversation, but the U.S. role or lack of a role at this point, what is the U.S. doing right now, and what should we be doing?
Well, the State Department a few hours ago issued a call for calm and for each side to show restraint. President Trump has talked about this since at least August. He spoke about it, for instance, at the UN General Assembly speech that he gave, and he mentioned it in October. I think that there's been behind-the-scenes diplomacy between the Trump administration and Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, but we have yet to see real action. There is a bill that is pending in the Senate, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019, passed the House, and this will make life pretty difficult for China. And China right now is complaining about it in public. So a lot of people would like to see a more Reagan-esque statement from President Trump on Hong Kong. I'm not sure we're going to get that anytime soon, but nonetheless, you can see the drift in Washington to be much more concerned about Hong Kong, especially as this violence gets worse and worse.
Real quick follow-up on the legislation. What's in it that really has China worried?
Anything that is legislation on Hong Kong is going to get China worried. But I think they're especially concerned about an annual review provision which requires the State Department to see whether there should be exemptions from China's sanctions for Hong Kong. We maintain those exemptions because Hong Kong is supposed to be governed autonomously, but if it's shown not to be, then those exemptions, which do channel a lot of technology to China, would be repealed. And indeed, they should be repealed because the factual basis for those exemptions no longer exists, as China has taken over Hong Kong.
Gordon, we'll be watching. And as always, we greatly appreciate your analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.
Gordon Chang is a longtime East Asia policy expert. He's the author of The Coming Collapse of China. You can follow him on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.